October 12, 1944. Camp Huntsville, Texas. The first thing they noticed was the silence. Not the harsh military kind, but a heavy, waiting quiet that made every sound, every boot step, every breath, echo across the yard. 27 German women stood in formation, dust settling around their ankles, the Texas sun cutting sharp, white lines across their faces. Their uniforms were wrinkled from transit, their boots caked with dried mud from 3 continents, their nerves pulled so tight they shook with the slightest movement. Then the order came. Shoes off, socks off, show us your feet. The words hung in the air like a physical object. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Some blinked, some stiffened, some stared at the American sergeant as if he had just spoken in a language no one on earth should understand. They had expected 100 things from their first morning in a U.S. prisoner of war camp: interrogation, confinement, humiliation, punishment, but not this. Feet, one woman whispered. What do they want with our feet? Another murmured. But the Americans did not answer. They did not gesture, threaten, or laugh. They stood like carved stone, rifles slung but not raised, faces serious, eyes fixed on the prisoners with an urgency that looked nothing like cruelty and everything like command. The women exchanged nervous glances. In Germany, such an order would be a prelude to degradation. In France, it had been a way to force prisoners to kneel. In the Atlantic transit, rumors said the Americans collected body parts for experiments. None of those possibilities seemed impossible. A tall woman near the front, Greta Schneider, 22, former radio operator, swallowed hard. She had survived the fall of Caen, the retreat toward the Seine, the terror of seeing Allied bombers carving the sky into sheets of fire. She had endured nights in cellars listening to British shells crush entire streets, and she had marched miles on blistered feet to reach a rail depot that no longer existed when she arrived. But nothing had prepared her for this strange, disorienting order in a country she had never expected to stand on. The sergeant stepped forward. His voice was calm but firm. Remove your shoes. Remove your socks. Now. Greta's hands trembled violently as she bent down. Leather scraped against her fingertips. Her shoelaces were stiff with salt and dirt from the crossing they had made. A war-length journey from Normandy fields, through Atlantic storms, to trains that cut across an America so vast she could not comprehend its scale. When she pulled her boot free, a sour smell rose instantly, thick and embarrassing. Others hesitated. One woman folded her arms tightly. Another whispered a prayer. Another shook her head, teeth clenched. Then a younger guard spoke, not unkindly. Ladies, this is an order. Do it, please. The word, please, only made the moment stranger. One by one, boots thudded onto the dust. Socks followed, damp, torn, stiff with sweat and grime. Bare feet touched the ground, pale against the red Texas earth. Some feet were swollen. Others were cracked open at the heels. One woman's toes were blackened around the nails, and when she saw them in the sunlight she looked horrified, as if she were seeing them truly for the first time. The Americans didn't react. They only watched, faces tightening, as though confirming something they already suspected. Greta's mind spun. Back home, Germany was unraveling. She had seen it in the last letters from her mother. Ink shaky, words short, sentences unfinished. Coal shortages, bread queues, hospitals running out of bandages, doctors reusing instruments because factories had been bombed flat, children fainting from hunger, women trading wedding rings for potatoes. She had read those words by lantern light and felt the war closing around her like a fist. Now, Here she stood in a country that looked untouched by the conflict swallowing Europe whole. Beyond the fences, the camp stretched in long, straight lines, barracks, mess halls, water towers, all built with a confidence that seemed almost arrogant. She had glimpsed the train yards on the way in, rows of locomotives that dwarfed anything German railways still possessed, warehouses filled with crates stamped with crisp stencils, trucks moving in steady, predictable patterns. Predictability. It felt like another universe. No rubble, no smoke, no desperation. America, she realized, was not merely surviving the war. It was thriving in it. She had overheard guards talking the night before, as she lay awake on her bunk, eyes tracing the shadows on the wooden ceiling. One had mentioned aircraft production. 96,000 planes this year alone. Another spoke about ships. Liberty vessels rolling out faster than the Germans can sink them. A third talked about rations. Even the prisoners get 3,000 calories a day. 3,000. She had not eaten that much in a week during the retreat. Now, barefoot in the dust, surrounded by enemies who didn't look angry or cruel, just alert, Greta felt a rising disorientation far more frightening than any shouted threat. The sergeant crouched down in front of one of the women. He didn't bark. He didn't leer. He simply pointed at her heel and said quietly to another guard, "Another one. Same signs. Get the medic." The guard jogged off toward the infirmary. A murmur rippled through the line of prisoners. Signs? Medic? What were they looking for? Greta's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She stared at her own feet, raw, cracked, the skin around her toes reddened, peeling. She remembered stumbling through muddy ditches in France, marching for days in wet boots that never dried, standing for hours in bombed-out shelters where sewage leaked across the floor. She had assumed the pain in her feet was simply part of being a soldier, part of losing, but now the American seemed to see something she did not. The sergeant straightened. His voice carried across the line again, steady, controlled, almost urgent. "Keep your shoes off. Don't put them back on until the medical officer tells you." A cold knot formed in Greta's stomach. Something was wrong. Something she didn't understand. Something the Americans clearly did. She looked around the yard, at the rows of barracks, at the guards who stood calmly in their pressed uniforms, at the giant water tower gleaming in the sun, at the flag rippling in the wind. Bright, clean, untouched by years of war. In that moment, she felt a strange, dizzying truth settle over her. The Reich had prepared her for cruelty. It had not prepared her for this, whatever this was. And as the medic hurried toward them, carrying a metal kit in one hand and clean towels in the other, Greta felt the first flicker of something she had not felt since the war began. Not fear, not hope, confusion. Deep, shattering confusion. Because nothing, absolutely nothing, matched the world she had been taught to believe, and the Americans, for reasons she could not yet imagine, were only just beginning. The medic's shadow had barely touched the ground when the next command fell. "All of you, inside, now." It hit the women harder than the sun, harder than the dust, harder than the shock of standing barefoot in a foreign land. Inside. The word carried weight, finality. A door closing. Greta felt her throat tighten as the guards motioned them toward a long wooden building near the edge of the compound, a structure she had barely noticed before. Its windows were small, its door was heavy, and as they approached, a faint metallic hiss drifted out from somewhere deep inside. Her pulse spiked. "Weitergehen, keep moving," a guard instructed, not shouting but firm enough that refusal felt impossible. The women shuffled forward barefoot on the hot earth. When the door swung open, the light inside was painfully bright. Too bright. It reflected off tile and concrete. It bounced off metal fixtures. It flooded every corner with a clinical glare that erased shadows and made everything feel exposed. Greta stopped breathing. Pipes ran across the ceiling like veins. Drains lined the floor. Steam curled from a row of nozzles at the far wall. And every nightmare propaganda poster she had ever seen turned real. She heard a small gasp beside her. Frida, the youngest of them all. Another woman whispered, 9. Das kann nicht sein. But belief didn't matter. Fear had already chosen its truth. Greta remembered the leaflets distributed in France by retreating German officers. Americans use gas on prisoners. American camps are experiments in humiliation. Those who surrender will disappear behind concrete walls. She had never believed all of it. But she had believed enough, and this room, this blinding, sterile room, fit the warnings too perfectly. A woman 2 places down dropped to her knees so suddenly that the guard behind her jolted in surprise. Bitte, bitte, nicht das, she cried, hands raised in surrender. Another clutched her friend's arm and whispered, trembling, "They brought us here to finish what the bombs started." A third covered her mouth with both hands, shaking so violently she nearly collapsed. Greta felt her legs turning to water. The light, the pipes, the drains, it all pressed in on her. The guards exchanged glances, confused glances, not sinister, but the women were too far gone to interpret them. They saw only what fear allowed them to see. A corporal stepped forward. "Ladies, keep moving," he said, carefully enunciating the words. His tone wasn't cruel, wasn't angry, but urgency is its own language. Urgency can be mistaken for threat. They shuffled deeper into the room as the door closed behind them with a dull, final thud that made several women flinch. The echo was too much like a bunker door being sealed, too much like the shelters in Cologne that trapped people beneath rubble, too much like every moment of helplessness they had known since 1943. The medic approached, holding his kit. He never raised his voice. But to the women, every step he took sounded like boots crossing a prison floor. "Stand in a line," he said gently. It didn't matter. They heard command where he intended care. Greta's fingers dug into her palm so hard she felt her nails break the skin. She tried to think of something steady, something real. But every memory that surfaced was another image of collapse. Bombed hospitals, crumbling streets, blood-soaked bandages, exhausted doctors shouting over wounded men on cold floors. Germany's medical system had already died long before she boarded the ship to America. She'd seen clinics without morphine, wards without heat, surgeons operating with water boiled in tin kettles because sterilizers no longer had electricity. The contrast made this room, bright, intact, clean, feel even more terrifying. How could the enemy have so much? How could a country at war afford light that never flickered? One of the guards took a step forward, concerned by the trembling women. But that only magnified the panic. The youngest prisoner wailed. Another began reciting a prayer through clenched teeth. 2 women gripped each other, knuckles white, bodies rigid. Greta tasted metal in her mouth. Her vision pulsed. She was moments from collapsing when the medic finally realized what was happening. He froze. Then his face softened, recognition dawning in a slow, heavy wave. He looked at the pipes, the drains, the nozzles, the terrified prisoners pressing back against the wall. And he understood. He took a step back, lowered his hands. Let the silence settle. Then, quietly, so quietly Greta almost didn't hear it, he said, You are not in danger. This is not what you think. The words hovered there, fragile and unreal. Some women didn't react. Some did, but only by shaking harder. The medic continued, voice steady, gentle. We're not here to hurt you. We're here to treat your feet. That's all. But fear is a stubborn animal. It doesn't retreat with logic. It retreats with proof. The medic opened his kit slowly, showing the contents as if approaching a wounded creature. Clean towels, ointment tins, rolls of gauze, a small stethoscope. He held them out in open palms. We're trying to help you. You're sick, all of you. The women hesitated. In the silence, Greta heard another sound. Faint, far off, drifting in through a high window. Laughter. American soldiers laughing outside. Not the laughter of cruelty or mockery. The laughter of men with full stomachs and easy mornings. A sound she hadn't heard from her own country in years. The realization, this accidental intrusion of normalcy, struck her so hard it knocked the breath from her. This wasn't Germany. This wasn't collapse. This wasn't fear turned into government policy. This was America, a nation with electricity, medicine, food, and an idea so alien it felt like sorcery. Healing your enemy is a moral duty. Red Cross plaques hung on the far wall. She hadn't noticed them before. Sterile basins gleamed under the lights. A row of neatly folded blankets sat on a shelf, untouched by dust. No camp in Germany had looked like this since 1940. For a moment, brief, thin as a thread, Greta felt something other than terror. Humiliation, relief, confusion. She wasn't sure which. The medic stepped closer, slowly, carefully. Your feet are infected. We need to clean them. If we don't, the damage could be permanent. His voice lacked threat. It carried only concern. But fear still clung to the room like smoke. Some women still trembled. Some still cried. One still clutched her friend's sleeve as if a single touch could anchor her to reality. And in the center of the line, Greta finally exhaled for the first time since entering the room. Not because she understood, not because she trusted, but because the Americans were acting like men who had nothing to hide. Nothing at all. And that, more than anything, terrified her. Because it meant everything she had believed might be wrong. And the truth, whatever it was about to reveal itself, one trembling foot at a time. The twist came in a single sentence, spoken softly enough to be missed, yet sharp enough to split the fear in half. You have trench rot. Infections. If we don't treat this, some of you may lose your feet. For a moment, the room didn't breathe. The German women stared at the medic, trying to reconcile his calm tone with the nightmare they had expected. Greta felt the words pass through her like a physical blow. Lose your feet? The idea seemed unreal, until she looked down at her own swollen, cracked skin and realized she had ignored the pain for months. There had never been time to worry about feet during the retreat. Feet were simply tools, tools that hurt. But here, in this bright room in a country untouched by rubble, the Americans were treating their pain as something worth fixing. The medic didn't hesitate. He knelt. A U.S. soldier, one of the enemies the Reich had promised was savage, dropped to one knee before a German prisoner and reached gently for her ankle. The woman flinched, but he spoke quietly. "Ma'am, I'm just cleaning it. Hold still." The inversion of power was so absolute it stunned the room into silence. A man who could command them, restrain them, punish them, was instead kneeling in the dust to wash their feet like a field nurse tending his own wounded. Warm water filled a metal basin. He dipped a cloth into it. Steam rose in soft curls. Then he wrapped the prisoner's foot in both hands and began to wipe away the dirt. No force, no cruelty, only care. Greta felt something twist painfully in her chest. Another medic moved to the next woman, opening his kit. Tins of sulfa powder, clean gauze, metal scissors that actually gleamed as if they'd never been used to cut anything harsher than cloth. A small glass vial of penicillin, something Greta had only heard rumors about, whispered by wounded men in field stations before Germany's supply lines collapsed. America had so much of it, they were giving it to prisoners. He gently held a woman's foot, examining the raw skin between her toes. "This is infected," he murmured. "We'll get it cleaned up." He didn't flinch when he saw blood. He didn't curse when he saw the cracked flesh. He didn't recoil when he noticed the smell. He simply worked. The other guards stood watch, not with suspicion, but with a quiet patience that seemed to fill the room like air. They were not rushing. They were not shouting. They were not treating the prisoners as lesser beings. They were acting as though this moment mattered, as though the health of these women mattered, not for politics, not for show, but because it was the right thing to do. Another American nurse stepped forward, a woman with weathered hands and a voice that carried a steady authority. She motioned for Greta. "Sit," she said, tapping the wooden bench. Greta obeyed, legs trembling. The nurse knelt and lifted Greta's foot onto her knee. She held it with surprising tenderness, as though handling something fragile. Then she used small scissors to trim the jagged nail that had split and begun to cut into the skin. "Does that hurt?" the nurse asked. Greta shook her head reflexively, though tears had already gathered at the corners of her eyes. "You've been walking on this for weeks," the nurse continued softly. "You shouldn't." Greta swallowed hard. There had been no should in Germany for a long time. Only must. Only endure. Only survive another day. The nurse dipped the cloth again, wiping away layers of dirt that Greta had stopped noticing months ago. Suds trickled in delicate streams down her heel, pooling on the floor. "Why?" Greta whispered, voice cracking. "Why are you doing this? For us." The nurse looked up. "Because you're hurt," she said simply, as if it required no explanation at all. Around them, the same scene repeated. An American soldier lifting a prisoner's ankle to check circulation. A medic gently massaging disinfectant into cracked skin. A nurse spreading ointment with the kind of care usually reserved for family. One woman covered her face with both hands and sobbed, shoulders shaking violently. The medic tending her hesitated for half a second, then reached out and placed a steadying hand on her arm. "You're safe," he assured. "No contempt, no impatience, just a quiet, weary kindness." Another woman clutched her friend's sleeve and whispered through tears, "Sie helfen uns. Sie helfen uns wirklich. They're helping us. They're truly helping us." Greta watched each gesture as if witnessing a foreign ritual. In Germany's final years, medicine had become a battlefield, rationed, improvised, exhausted. Supplies vanished, hospitals burned. Surgeons worked with shaking hands and dwindling tools. She remembered standing in line for hours at a makeshift clinic in Bremen, receiving nothing but a bandage already stained gray from reuse. Yet here, in a land where war seemed only a distant rumor, the Americans treated infections as battles worth fighting. They treated prisoners as patients. They treated pain as something undeserved. The nurse patted Greta's ankle. "All done," she said with a small smile. "You'll be walking better soon." Greta blinked rapidly, trying to steady her voice. "I don't understand," she whispered. The nurse paused. "You don't have to," she replied. "Just heal." Another medic moved past with a tray of small bottles, each labeled in neat handwriting. Penicillin, sulfa, alcohol tincture. Greta stared at them as if they were artifacts from another world, one she had nearly forgotten existed, a world with abundance, with order, with mercy, a world she'd been told was decadent, weak, immoral. Yet nothing about this felt weak. It felt steady, grounded, moral. The medic treating Frida's foot spoke quietly to her as he worked. "You'll be okay, I promise." Frida covered her mouth, breath shaking. "Why would you promise that?" she asked, voice thin. He looked at her with something like surprise. "Because it's my job," he said. "Because it's what we do." Greta heard those words echo in her skull long after he said them. Because it's what we do. It was a sentence that didn't exist in the Reich. Duty in Germany meant sacrifice, obedience, suffering. Duty in America meant the opposite. It meant responsibility. It meant protection. Meant, unthinkably, kindness. The nurse stood, wiped her hands, and called for the next woman. The guards relaxed slightly, leaning back on their heels. The fear in the room thinned, dissolved, replaced by a stunned quiet. And Greta, staring at her newly bandaged foot, realized that this gentle, measured, almost casual mercy was the second shock of the day. The first shock had been fear. The second was far more dangerous. Hope. The moment that changed everything arrived quietly. So quietly that most of the women didn't notice it at first. It wasn't an announcement or a sudden revelation or anything grand at all. It was a pair of socks. Greta was still sitting on the wooden bench, flexing her now bandaged foot, when the door creaked open and a young American soldier stepped inside, holding a stack of folded wool. His uniform was crisp, his face sunburned, his expression oddly gentle for someone who had been trained to guard enemies. He walked past the medic, past the nurse, past the two guards at the door, and stopped in front of her. "Your feet need warmth," he said simply. He extended a pair of thick gray socks, new, clean, untouched by dirt or war. "Take these." Greta stared at them, frozen. Not because she didn't understand the gesture, but because she understood it too well. These were not scraps, not ration leftovers, not something repurposed or begrudgingly offered. These were new supplies, supplies someone in this camp had decided she deserved. Her throat tightened. She reached out slowly, fingertips brushing the soft wool as if unsure it would stay solid. Behind her, someone whispered, "My own officers never cared like this." The sentence drifted across the room like smoke, sharp and impossible to ignore. A few women nodded without meaning to. Others looked down at their bandaged feet, remembering blood-soaked marches, officers shouting, "Whiter!" as they limped across broken ground. No German officer had knelt to tend a blister. No German officer had saved medicine for the weak. No German officer had told them their pain mattered. But here, in an enemy nation half a world away, a young man was offering socks. Greta held them to her chest without quite knowing why. The soldier didn't wait for thanks. He just gave a short nod and moved to the next woman, placing another pair of socks into trembling hands. Each gesture fell like a small stone into still water, ripples spreading outward, touching every corner of the room. Something new crept in behind the fear, something unsettling, something that made it harder to cling to the stories they had been fed. Kindness, not the strategic kind. Not the manipulative kind, the ordinary kind, quiet, unceremonious, unearned. Greta watched as the soldier handed Frida a pair of socks and offered a faint smile. She saw Frida's lower lip quiver, saw confusion cloud her face, saw her whisper a barely audible "Danke," as though ashamed to speak it aloud. The soldier answered with a soft, "You're welcome," and moved on. There was no tension in his body, no caution in his movements, no trace of the fear the women had been taught Americans harbored toward Germans. And that, paradoxically, made it even harder to understand. A medic approached Greta again, checking the tightness of her bandage. "Let me know if it aches later," he said. She nodded mutely. He paused, studying her expression. "You don't have to be afraid," he said gently. Greta lowered her eyes. "I don't understand any of this." He didn't answer right away. He straightened, wiping his hands on a towel as if choosing words carefully. "Where I come from," he finally said, "you help someone if they're hurting. Doesn't matter who they are." She lifted her head slightly. "Even enemies?" He shrugged. "People first, everything else second." Another crack formed, not in the medic's voice but in the armor she wore around her thoughts. Thin, sudden, irreversible. Everything she'd been taught depended on Americans being cruel, weak, or immoral. Nothing in this room matched that picture. Not the clean basins, not the fresh bandages, not the new socks now warming her palms. Another woman, Anna, spoke from the far end of the room. Her voice was watery but clear. "If this is the enemy," she said softly, "then perhaps we never understood the world at all." No one contradicted her. Even those who clung hardest to the Reich stories could not deny what their eyes saw and their bodies felt. The nurse moved among them with the practiced calm of someone who believed in duty, not as obedience, but as service. She tightened a bandage, then helped one woman pull her sock on gently, careful not to disturb the ointment beneath. Greta watched the action with a strange ache in her chest. In another life, this same nurse might have tended her in a civilian hospital, asked about her family, brought warm broth after surgery. In another life, they might not have been enemies at all. Yet here they were, American hands healing German wounds. The shock of it washed through the room slowly. Fear loosened its grip. Breathing softened. The trembling at the edges of people's voices faded just enough to leave space for something else. Questions. Dangerous questions. Greta looked at her feet, wrapped in fresh gauze, resting in a pair of socks someone had chosen for her comfort. She whispered under her breath, barely audible. "Everything we believed. Was it all a lie?" The room seemed to hold its breath with her. Beyond the walls, the camp hummed with the steady rhythm of American life, tractors rolling past, guards chatting casually, the distant clang of pots from the mess hall where lunch was already being prepared. A world running smoothly, confidently, without fear of collapse. A world that could afford kindness. Greta felt that truth settling into her like warm water spreading through cold skin. This camp was not a trap. These Americans were not monsters. And maybe, just maybe, the terrifying, blinding possibility was this. They had been human all along. A new kind of fear rose in her, not of harm, but of understanding. What did it mean if the enemy was not evil? What did it mean if mercy was stronger than hatred? What did it mean for everything she had survived and everything she had believed? Outside, the sun caught the American flag, and it rippled in the breeze with a kind of effortless certainty. Inside, Greta held the socks to her chest and felt her world tilt. Something inside her had begun to crack, and through the crack, the first light was beginning to slip in. The breakdown didn't begin with shouting or collapse. It began with a sleeve, rolled up halfway, almost casually, revealing a small faded tattoo that did not belong in a sunny room in Texas. A734. The numbers struck Greta like a fist to the chest. She'd seen them before. Not on Americans, never on enemies, but on shivering women in grainy photographs passed secretly among soldiers. Photographs labeled only one thing: Auschwitz. The nurse, Ruth Abramson, didn't seem to notice the shock that radiated through the room the moment the ink appeared. She was too focused on the foot she cradled in her hands, Frida's foot, still swollen, still trembling slightly from pain and exhaustion. "Hold still," Ruth murmured. "This won't sting long." Silence swallowed the room. Even the Americans paused. Even the guards lowered their gaze. Greta stared. Her mind fought the truth, clawing at the edges of denial, but the numbers didn't fade. A Jewish survivor. Here, in a U.S. Army nurse's uniform, washing the wounds of German prisoners. The world tilted sideways. Ruth dipped the cloth into warm water and gently wiped away the dried blood between Frida's toes. Her movements were steady, almost tender. Then she opened a small jar of ointment, scooped a bit onto her fingers, and smoothed it over the cracked skin. Frida winced. Ruth paused. "Pain doesn't make you strong," she said softly, almost to herself. Then she looked up, meeting Frida's wide, wet eyes. "Mercy does." The sentence shattered something in the air. A fragile wall, long held up by fear and pride, finally giving way. Frida's face crumpled. In one trembling exhale, she began to sob. Loud, broken, raw. Her hands flew to her face, but she couldn't stop the sounds that poured out of her. Greta felt her own vision blur. Other women wiped their cheeks, but tears only smeared the dust into streaks on their skin. Ruth didn't pull away. She tightened her grip gently, keeping Frida's foot steady. "It's all right," she murmured. "You're safe here." Safe. The word twisted like a blade. The Americans were offering safety to the very people whose uniformed countrymen had carved those numbers into Ruth's arm. Greta felt her knees weaken. She reached blindly for the bench and sank down before her legs gave out completely. Beside her, Anna whispered something brittle and terrified. How can she touch us?" No one answered, because the answer was visible. It was in the warmth of the water. It was in the fresh socks. It was in the bandages tied with careful hands. It was in Ruth's voice, strong enough to have survived hell, gentle enough to offer comfort to enemies. Another prisoner, Marta, pulled her knees to her chest and whispered, "I believed the lies. Now I see the truth." Her voice cracked, then broke. It was us. It was us who were blind. Greta clasped her hands together, trembling. Images flooded her mind. Officers shouting about German superiority, posters showing Americans as monsters, lectures warning of Allied cruelty. She thought of how fiercely she had clung to those warnings, how they had shaped her fear, her hatred, her obedience. But none of those visions could survive the sight of a Jewish nurse wrapping gauze around a German girl's foot. A wave of shame washed over her, not the humiliating shame of defeat, but something deeper, older, heavier, a shame she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. Ruth moved from Frida to the next woman. She did not hide her tattoo. She did not soften her movements to perform forgiveness. She just worked, methodically, compassionately. When she reached Greta, their eyes met. Gray meeting brown, fear meeting strength, guilt meeting mercy. Greta opened her mouth to speak, but found no words. Ruth lowered herself to one knee and gently took Greta's foot in her hands. Her fingers were steady, practiced. She checked the bandage, inspected the edges of the skin, nodded approvingly. "You're healing," Ruth said softly. Greta swallowed hard. "You," the word stuck. She tried again. "You help us?" Ruth tilted her head slightly as if puzzled the question even needed asking. "I help people," she replied. "That's the job." Greta pressed her lips together to keep them from trembling. She wanted to say something, ask forgiveness, offer apology, confess ignorance, but the words collapsed before they reached her throat. Ruth applied a thin line of ointment along the arch of Greta's foot. "This part was inflamed," she explained gently, "but it's already improving." Greta's voice finally cracked free, a whisper barely audible. "You shouldn't care. Not after what happened to you." Ruth paused, hands resting lightly on Greta's ankle. Her eyes softened, not with pity, but with something far more difficult to endure. "I'm not here to punish the sick," she said quietly. "I'm here to make sure they get better." Greta broke. The tears came so fast they startled even her. Her hands shot up to cover her face, but the sounds, low, shaking, helpless, filled the room before she could stop them. Ruth didn't touch her. She didn't need to. Mercy already had. All around them, the same collapse echoed in different forms. A woman sobbing into her hands. Another whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. Another rocking slightly, staring at her bandages as if they were impossible. Another reaching out blindly to touch her friend's shoulder, needing contact, needing proof that this moment was real. Inside that infirmary, something dissolved, something ancient, brittle, built on fear and propaganda and years of war. The idea of the enemy. It fell apart under the weight of warm water, clean bandages, and a Jewish nurse's steady hands. Greta lowered her palms slowly, face streaked with tears. She looked at Ruth through blurred vision and whispered the only truth she could find. "I didn't know. I didn't know anything." Ruth didn't smile. She didn't reassure her. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging a wound that couldn't be treated with ointment. "You know now," she said. Greta bowed her head. In that moment, she wasn't a prisoner. She wasn't German. She wasn't an enemy. She was a human being who had finally seen clearly, and the clarity hurt more than any infection ever could. The room quieted, not with fear, but with something gentler, heavier, almost sacred. A moment of shared recognition, carried not in words but in trembling breaths and lowered eyes. America had revealed itself, not just as powerful, not just as victorious, but as merciful. And that mercy, offered by the very person who had every right to withhold it, broke them more completely than any cruelty ever could. It was the moment they understood the truth the Reich had never prepared them for. The enemy had saved them, and in doing so had shattered what they once believed unbreakable. The transformation didn't begin with a speech, or command, or even a conscious decision. It began with a broom. 3 days after the collapse in the infirmary, Greta found herself standing in the doorway of that same bright room, no longer trembling, no longer bracing herself for cruelty, but holding a simple wooden broom with both hands. Around her, other German women waited in an uncertain line, their bandaged feet resting awkwardly inside their new socks. The American nurse, Ruth Abramson, looked up from her cart of supplies. Her face didn't soften with surprise. She only raised an eyebrow, curious. Greta swallowed. "Let us help," she said. Her voice wavered but didn't break. She glanced back at the others, then added, "We want to work in the infirmary." For a moment, the room froze. The guards exchanged looks. The medics paused mid-motion. Even the sunlight seemed to still against the wall. Ruth stared at Greta for a long, unreadable second. Then she set down her clipboard. "All right," she said simply. "No ceremony. No dramatic forgiveness. Just a door, quietly opened. They began with the humblest tasks. Ruth handed Greta a tray of glass instruments, scalpels, tweezers, small curved scissors. Wash them. In the basin, she instructed. Dry them completely. Don't touch the blades. Greta nodded, careful as she carried the tray to the counter. Warm water filled the metal sink. She dipped each tool into the suds, scrubbing gently, the clink of steel against steel echoing like music she had never learned to hear. Beside her, Anna folded gauze. Marta organized vials of sulfa powder and penicillin. Frida cleaned the examination tables with slow, reverent strokes. No one spoke at first, not the Americans, not the POWs. But the silence wasn't tense anymore. It held possibility. When Greta set the cleaned instruments onto a towel, Ruth inspected them with unexpected trust. "That's good work," she said. Greta felt her chest tighten with something unfamiliar. Pride. Not the hollow pride demanded by officers or ideology, but the small, solid pride of doing good. The next day, the medics let them assist more directly. Not on the wounded, not yet, but on the daily routines that kept the infirmary running. "Bring me the alcohol," a medic said, and Anna fetched it without hesitation. "Hold this light steady," he told Marta while he examined a prisoner's stitched ankle. "Fold these cloths," he instructed Frida. They obeyed, not as prisoners obey orders, but as students learning a craft. And for the first time in months, maybe years, they felt useful in a way that didn't involve fear, marching, or war. Something inside Greta shifted each time she handed a fresh roll of bandages to Ruth. It was a strange, grounding feeling, like rediscovering a part of herself she'd forgotten existed. A part capable of gentleness. A part that war had not destroyed. On the fourth day, Ruth handed her a small bottle. "Drop 2 of these onto the wound," she said. Greta stared. "You trust me to do that?" Ruth shrugged lightly. "I trust your hands." Greta's breath hitched. By the end of the first week, the German women weren't just assisting. They were anticipating. Before a medic asked, Anna already prepared the saline. Before Ruth reached for gauze, Frida had set 3 stacks beside her. Before the guards unlocked the infirmary door each morning, Greta was already waiting on the bench, sleeves rolled up. The transformation was so gradual it felt natural, so effortless it felt inevitable. But it wasn't. It was a choice. One they made every morning they walked back through that door. One afternoon, while cleaning an irrigation bowl, Greta overheard 2 American guards talking outside the open window. "You see those German girls," one said. "They're working harder than some of our own recruits." The other guard snorted with a grin. "Maybe they're trying to make up for the war." "Can't blame them," the first replied. "Ruth says they're doing good, and if Ruth says it, it's gospel." Greta felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she didn't let herself cry. Not this time. This wasn't sorrow. It was something warmer, something healing, recognition. After everything, after fear, after propaganda, after the weight of a collapsing homeland, she was being seen, not as an enemy, not as a burden, not as a number on a roster, but as a person capable of kindness. That night, lying on her bunk under the Texas moonlight, she opened her small paper journal, a worn notebook the Americans had given each POW for writing letters home. She wrote, "America healed our bodies, but more importantly, America healed our hatred." She paused, reading the line back to herself, surprised by how easily it had flowed from her mind. Hatred had been taught to her as survival. Here, it felt meaningless. Here, it felt small. She continued writing. "I thought mercy was weakness, but here, it is strength. Here, the enemy kneels to wash your wounds. Here, the victors care for the defeated. Here, I am learning how to be human again." She closed the journal and pressed it to her chest. 2 mornings later, as Greta swept the infirmary floor, Ruth approached her with a stack of folded towels. "You know," Ruth said, "not everyone would volunteer for this." Greta hesitated. "It feels right," she answered softly. Ruth was quiet for a moment, watching her sweep. "Then keep doing it," she said. "Not because you have to, because you choose to." Greta nodded slowly, because choice, real choice, was a luxury she had not possessed in a long, long time. She glanced at the other German women assembling bandage kits, checking expiration dates on vials, even laughing softly at an inside joke only they understood. It wasn't the infirmary that made the difference. It was the freedom inside it, the freedom to help, to care, to rebuild, even in captivity. It was the freedom to choose mercy over memory. Later that week, an older German prisoner, a man who had broken 2 toes during work detail, was carried into the infirmary, pale and sweating. Marta fetched the towel. Anna helped position the lamp. Frida arranged the instruments. Greta stepped forward without being asked, holding the man's arm gently as the medic cut away the damaged nail. "It's all right," she whispered in German. "You're safe now." The words startled her. They were the same words Ruth had spoken. And in speaking them, Greta realized something profound. Mercy didn't dilute strength. It created it. She looked at Ruth across the room. The nurse met her gaze and nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement of the bridge they had built together. A bridge that had begun with fear, crossed through compassion, and now rested on something sturdier than either. Understanding. That evening, Greta returned to her journal and wrote a final line. "If I ever have children, I will tell them this. The Americans defeated us. But they saved us too." She closed the book with steady hands. War had broken her world. Mercy had begun to rebuild it. And though she was still a prisoner behind barbed wire, she had discovered a truth far larger than captivity. You cannot fear the people whose kindness you now carry inside you. The war ended not with a shout, but with a quiet knock on the barracks door. A guard stepped inside, holding a clipboard under his arm, dust on his boots, sunrise at his back. "Pack your things," he said softly. "You're going home." For a long moment, no one moved. Home? Germany. The word felt foreign, like a childhood memory blurred by smoke. Greta sat on her bunk, staring at the small pile of items that now represented the most important journey of her life. They weren't valuables. They weren't medals. They weren't the tokens soldiers usually collected from war. She carried a pair of American socks, a small journal filled with notes about mercy, a bottle of antiseptic the medic insisted she keep. 3 English words she had learned by heart. You are safe. But the thing she carried that weighed the most, the thing she could not pack into her bag, was a new way of seeing the world. Not a souvenir, a transformation. The transport ship groaned as it cut across the Atlantic, packed with former POWs heading toward a homeland they no longer recognized. Some stood at the railings, staring at the endless steel-blue water. Others sat in silence, clutching their bags. Greta opened her journal and read the lines she had written under the Texas moonlight. America healed our bodies. But more importantly, America healed our hatred. She pressed her fingertips to the words. They felt heavier now. Frida approached, sitting beside her with a shy smile. "You still writing about the nurses?" she asked. Greta nodded. "I don't want to forget," she said quietly. "Neither do I," Frida whispered. Around them, the other women held similar keepsakes: a tin of ointment, a folded towel Ruth had secretly slipped into a bag, a dictionary page with English phrases. But nothing matched the invisible thing they carried: gratitude toward the enemy who had shown them mercy. Germany appeared on the horizon like a scar. Bombed cities, collapsed bridges, forests stripped bare by war, train stations packed with gaunt faces and hollow eyes, the women stepped off the ship and onto soil that no longer felt like theirs. People stared at them, not with joy, not with relief, but with confusion. "Were you treated badly?" a stranger asked. Greta hesitated. How could she explain? How could she tell them that the enemy had washed their wounds, given them socks, spoken to them calmly, treated them with dignity their own officers had abandoned years ago? Instead, she simply said, "No, we were treated kindly." Kindly, a word that felt dangerous to speak in a land still smoldering with resentment. But it was true. The years passed. Children were born, cities rebuilt. New borders were drawn. Germany became another version of itself, smaller, quieter, humbled. Greta grew older. She married a schoolteacher. She had 2 daughters. She planted a garden behind the house, and on winter nights she sat by the stove and polished the same pair of socks now patched a dozen times but still warm enough to cradle memory. When her daughters asked about the war, she didn't speak of battles or fear. She spoke of Texas, of the infirmary, of the American nurse with the steady hands. "America fed us when Germany could not," she told them. "America did not hate us." And finally, her voice always softest here, "We survived because the Americans were merciful." Her daughters listened with wide eyes, learning a version of the war no textbook had yet dared to teach. As they grew older, they carried those stories to their own children. A lineage of truth passed down not through heroism, but through humanity. Across the ocean, decades later, someone in America uploaded an old photograph of Camp Huntsville. It showed a row of German women, thin, barefoot, wrapped in American blankets, standing beside the infirmary door. The caption read, "POW women during medical inspection, 1944. The image spread online. People in Texas recognized the landscape. Some recognized the buildings. A few recognized the uniforms. Then, in the comments, names began to appear. Grandchildren of POWs, typing from Germany, Australia, Brazil. My grandmother was at Camp Huntsville. She always spoke of the kindness of American soldiers. America saved my grandfather's life. Thank you, United States. My family exists because you showed mercy." And beneath those comments, Americans replied, "This is the America our grandparents built, a nation that believed in right and wrong. We could learn from that version of ourselves." It became more than a photograph. It became a reminder of an America that once believed mercy was a weapon stronger than fear. A reminder of a generation, the greatest generation, who held to their values even when facing enemies. A reminder of what the country could be again. Before Greta died, she wrote one final entry in her journal, her handwriting shaky but still determined. If America wished to break us, it would have starved us. Instead, it fed us. If America wished to hurt us, it would have punished us. Instead, it healed us. If America wished to hate us, it had every reason. Instead, it chose mercy. She closed the journal with trembling hands and whispered the sentence that had become her truth. America was powerful because it was kind, and in the darkest moments of war, it chose mercy over hatred. That, more than weapons, was what made it great. Her children kept that journal. Her grandchildren translated it. Today, her great-grandchildren share it online, where strangers in Texas read it and feel a quiet pride swell in their chests. Because history is not only written in battles, it is also written in bandages, in warm socks, in gentle hands, and in a Jewish nurse kneeling beside an enemy girl to say, "Pain doesn't make you strong. Mercy does." And America, at its best, always understood that.